Cool, man. Let's jump in then.
Sure.
This is technically an extension of the month of July, but we are very far behind. I got a little bit behind in June, which caught up in July, and then the month of July was a whole shitstorm in and of itself. So the this is the second week technically in nutrition, which is July, but we'll try to catch back up in the month of August, and then we'll move into hydration. So they should blend pretty well together, but for tonight's topic, the subtopic underneath nutrition is macronutrients. So the overview here is really simple because there's only three categories. There's no real if, ands, or buts about it. So there's only really one way to conceptualize it. The three macronutrients are carbohydrate, fat, and protein. And most people are pretty well familiar with them, but we can get into the details of each of them, kind of the pros and cons, or who needs what as we go through the presentation. So, starting with carbohydrate, this is the primary source of energy. If you think about anything or if you learn anything from this, carbohydrates are energy. And specifically, we look at the way that we measure scientifically, I guess, if you will, the energy content within different substrates is carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram of carbohydrates. So, for example, if you've got something that has 10 grams of carbohydrate, that would equate to 40 calories for whatever that item is. And so this becomes important when you put it into practical application. So if you're looking at the nutrition label on any of your foods, you look at the energy content, the total caloric content, and then you can also calculate out which portions of these calories are coming from different sources. The what is it? The FDA. Their nutrition label doesn't require them to put a percentage of the energy source or contribution on it. Rather, what they do is like the daily recommended intake, and so they have the carbohydrates. It'll say something like 10 grams, and then it'll say 5% or something along those lines. And so what that's telling you is how much of that energy source you should be getting throughout the course of a day. So when we look at things like bread, where it might have 100 calories, but it's probably got 20 grams of carbohydrates, we know that 10, or let's see, what did I just say? 20 times 4 would be 80. So we know that 20 calories would be coming from some other source, whether that's fat or protein. The way that the body utilizes carbohydrates, typically in its simplest form, it's going to be broken down and utilized by glucose. And this goes for pretty much any carbohydrate source. And so the glucose is the molecule that's going to be floating through the blood and being transported to the different tissues in the body for actual cellular utilization. And so if it's not readily used, if it's not being used actively as it's floating through the blood, then it's going to get stored. And it's primarily being stored as glycogen first, and then it's going to be stored as fat after the glycogen stores have been topped off. So the way that glycogen works is basically you have two different locations where carbohydrates can be stored for easy breakdown of muscle. You can kind of think of it like a bank account for carbohydrates. So you have your fat stores, but those take a lot longer to metabolize. So if you're trying to use your fat stores for energy, you have to be doing something for a long time because the chemical breakdown of fat takes a lot longer than free floating carbohydrate or even breaking down glycogen. So glycogen is basically a chain of carbohydrate, a really long chain of carbohydrate that's stored within two locations. One is the muscle tissue. So actually in your skeletal muscle, there's stores of carbohydrate. And then that way, if your muscles get fatigued, they can easily access the next fastest source of energy. So it uses the free floating glucose first, and then it'll kick on to the glycogen stores once it's depleted of the free floating glucose. So the second place that it gets stored is the liver. And so the liver can actually break down and then distribute glycogen as glucose throughout the bloodstream. Some examples of carbohydrate: grains, fruits, vegetables, sugars, pretty much anything that you see in the picture on the right. And so the way that it's commonly discussed in just like ordinary language is complex carbs or simple carbs. And really what this is showing is, are these more likely to have a single glucose molecule, a simple sugar, or does it have a branch of connected carbohydrates? And these things take a little bit longer because we have to literally break down the chemical bonds between the carbohydrates in order to utilize them. So if it's something like an energy drink or a soda, it already has free floating sugar. It's a really simple sugar to break down. Whereas something like grains or bread, rice, these have longer branches of carbs, which have more energy. But then because it has more energy, you have to access it. So you have to break it down first to be able to utilize it. Any questions, comments about that so far?
Yeah, so during my studies, particularly with the nutrition chapter, they they refer to simple and complex carbs as like low glycemic index and high glycemic index. Is that synonymous with like complex and simple carbs?
Um, that's a great question that I don't know it's a really technical question, so I don't know the answer off the top of my head. Typically, so what high glycemic index is really high concentration of calories with really low nutritional value. So it's a really like just dense source of basic. Usually, it's sugar in the American diet. So things like donuts or cookies, for example, you get a ton of sugar content, ton of caloric content relative to the rest of the portions. So you're not getting a ton of protein and stuff like that. And if I remember correctly, the difference between the simple and the complex carbs is how many carbs are in the chain of the actual energy source. So, for example, I believe it's anything below 5 carbohydrates. In the chain are considered to be simple carbs because there's less chemical bonds in between those energy sources versus something that has a much longer branch of, let's say, 20 to 30 carbs. Those would be because it's carbon units is what it's literally measuring. It's carbon, I believe, oxygen and hydrogen. Taking me way back to chemistry 101, but so the chemical compound or the bonds in between those carbon units is what is getting measured in the simple versus complex carb. It's how many carbon units are in that chain. What that would relate to in terms of glycemic index is essentially a measure of how dense those calories are, the sugar specifically.
Got it.
So
And
I don't think it's an exact 1-to-1 to
okay,
answer your question more directly.
got it. And generally speaking, you're gonna want high glycemic index during physical activity because, from what I understood, it's easier to digest those carbs and use it more readily as a fuel source quicker than a low glycemic index carb.
Yeah, that one is for sure true. The lower glycemic index foods are going to be harder to break down, and they're going to take a little bit longer because of that. So, this is why you'll see people who are going out on like longer endurance events, like runs or cycling. They're consuming things like energy gels, which is just a really dense form of carbohydrate. Or they're doing things like gummies, fruit snacks, fruits, anything that is like really one, either liquid or two, really dense carbohydrates.
Got it. Cool. Thank you.
Mhm. So the next source of energy is fat, and this is typically the most calorically dense food source. And so the calories per gram you can see here is 9. And so this differs from carbs and protein, which both have 4. So gram for gram, weight for weight, or I suppose mass for mass if you want to be technical, the mass being equal between fat and carbs, the fat will have more calories than the carbs will. So the it's a really dense source of energy, and calorically speaking, it's really easy to load up on calories because it's so dense with calories. The second role that it has within the body is vitamin absorption. So specifically with the fat soluble vitamins, having these in your system will help to essentially break down and absorb the fat soluble vitamins. The utilization within the body, again, this is a dense storage of energy. So you're using the triglyceride storage system, which is essentially like this really neatly filed line of fatty tissue that's being stored then within fat cells. And so the more that you can kind of jam those together, they're kind of a zigzag pattern, but they literally fit like side by side. So they're kind of like this, where there's not a ton of space in between them. And so they align really nicely, and they're stored really densely within the human body, which is great for survival because we can pack on tons of extra calories that we can use in the case of an emergency. But it can be problematic in a modern society where there's no shortage of food and we have plenty of food that we can continue to consume. And the larger problem that we see is with increased body fat composition. We see these increases in body fat percentage, and that comes essentially comes with all of the health concerns that we see, things like diabetes, heart issues, a ton of just different GI issues. There's a lot of medical conditions that come from having too much fat stored within the human body. Some examples of the fat on the right, you can see the what are so-called healthy fats. This is I have a bit of a bone to pick with the terminology there, healthy and unhealthy, but for the most part, it's describing saturated versus unsaturated fats. And so for the examples here, you'll see things that are oils, nuts, seeds, avocados, and then fatty fish. So these are all going to have slightly different vitamin profile, and they're going to have slightly different effects on the body relative to that vitamin profile. But what you need to know about fats is that it's a good source of energy, and it can help your body to absorb some of those fat soluble vitamins, which are A, D, E, and K. Any comments, questions about fat?
Yeah, so just tying it back to my CSCS studying. So we need oxygen in order to break down fat to use it for energy. So it's primarily used in aerobic exercise, anything that's longer than like 3 minutes or so.
Yeah, the CSCS will teach you that it's like a on/off energy system. In reality, there's a bit more of like a gradient and a crossover between energy systems. But yeah, in general, the longer duration exercise will start to oxidize. You'll get some of those oxidative pathways going for energy systems, as opposed to those glycolytic, which are a little bit shorter duration. Or if you get that phosphocreatine system, which is the shortest, or I suppose alactic would be, or alactic would be the shortest, which is less than like half a second. But anything 1 second to about 10 seconds, up to what's the next one? Glycolytic would be anaerobic glycogen, would be something like, I think, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I would assume it would be somewhere in that 2 to 3 minutes range.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. So from what I remember, the first one they talked about in the book was creatine phosphate, which is like 1 to 10 seconds, and then they mentioned slow glycolysis and fast
Yep.
glycolysis. That was
Yep.
the terms that they used, and then next would go the aerobic one, which is primarily uses fats.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah, because it's describing the different metabolic pathways for generating energy.
Mm-hmm.
And so anytime you can use oxygen, you have a more efficient system for creating ATP. If you have no oxygen, then you have to rely on the fuel source or the substrate that you have available, which is typically a lot lower supply than your body's storages of fats. So if you can break down and metabolize fat, then you can get a lot more ATP, but that comes at the expense of speed. So if you're doing something like a sprint, it's going to take far too long. You're going to be done with your event. Say you have the 100-meter, you're going to be done with your event by the time you even start to process some of those fat metabolism. So the way that I kind of break down or to conceptualize the different energy systems is by track and field event. The things like a high jump or a long jump, those take like 1 or 2 seconds. So there's actually one that's before the PCR system, and that's the alactic. So anything that's considered to be like non-fatiguing, like you're doing like a max jump or a counter movement jump on a force plate, and you do 1 rep. If it's not fatiguing to the body to the point where you are needing energy, then it's considered alactic. And again, this takes less than 1 second. Anything more than 1 second, you're probably into that PCR system where you actually have to create ATP. But you do have some small amount of ATP that's free floating, that's already ready to be utilized at any time. But yeah, so then the PCR system would be your 100-meter event. Technically, you're going to run out before your 100-meter because we know that this is somewhere in the 6 to 8 second range is the maximum for it. And the fastest time in the world is like 9.5 seconds. So you actually start to get into a little bit of that fast glycolysis as you get into the 100-meter. But broadly speaking, it's a PCR race. When you get into that 200-meter, then you start to look at, okay, well, now it's 20 seconds. You're definitely into that fast glycolysis. Anything into like the 400-meter where you're getting up and over a minute, unless you're really fast, then you start to look at some of that longer glycolysis, slow glycolysis. And then you look at your longer events like the mile, the 1600, then you start to get into those oxidative energy systems.
Got it. Yeah, that's really helpful. I think it's helpful for me to tie together what macronutrients are going to be primarily sourcing which energy systems, and then again trying to tie that back to when are we using certain energy systems and for what athletic events.
Yeah, there's a really good chart, and I don't remember where it is. If it's from, I don't think it's from the NSCA, but it's a really good chart that shows the different contributions of different substrates throughout time. So if you've got a 10-second event, it'll show it's largely glucose, but there is going to be some small contribution from fat and from protein that's probably like less than 1% from each of them. But the longer you go, you're going to get contribution from carbohydrates, from fat, and from protein. And you're going to see it's not a start stop. This is the end of carbohydrate and the start of fat. There's a transition and an overlap between those fuel sources. So I'll see if I can find that chart and send it to you, and then hopefully it'll help you to kind of visualize when those cutoffs are.
Cool. Yeah, that'd be really helpful.
All right, so then the last macronutrient here is protein. And so the function of protein is commonly known as like the building blocks. And so without protein, your body's not able to restore or build new tissue. And so this includes anything from your skin, your hair, your nails, your blood plasma, literally anything with a structure. The protein is what makes it up. And so you need protein in order to sustain your body structure. Again, 4 calories per gram here, so it's very calorically similar to carbohydrate. The interesting or unique factor with protein is that it's such a dense mechanical structure that in order to break it down, your body actually has to use a little bit more energy to digest it. So this creates this kind of what is called a thermogenic effect. So your body basically creates a little bit of heat in order to help break down that protein source. So even though calorically it's the same as carbohydrates, the net that you get from the calories burned while consuming it, plus the calorie that you ate, you actually get slightly less than 4 grams on a yield. So just kind of an interesting thing to note. This becomes important for things like fat loss. Anybody who's trying to lose weight, one of the tweaks that they can make is they can eat a slightly more dense protein rich diet. And then this creates a little bit more, what do they call it? TEF, I believe, thermic effect of food. And so your body burns slightly more calories throughout the day than you would if you were eating carbohydrate or fat. Not necessarily that important for most athletes because they're not trying to actively lose weight, but anybody who's trying to lose weight either in the Gen Pop or say you have an athlete who's trying to make weight or lose weight to get down into a weight class, then that kind of stuff becomes more important. The other thing that's interesting with protein is if you're trying to lose weight, then your muscle gets depleted and you're going to start to break down muscle as a fuel source. So one of the things that happens is if you overconsume protein, then you can actually save some of that muscle and keep it from wasting away. Some examples of protein, and there's a lot of different sources here. A lot of people only ever think of kind of the big three, which is like meat, poultry, fish, but there's also eggs, there's dairy, there's beans, and there's lentils. And this one's a bit interesting because I think it's a really easy supplement that everybody always is aware of. But the protein supplement is essentially just a dairy that's condensed down into a powder form. So things like whey protein powder. It is effectively just dairy, but it's in a really concentrated form, easier to process and digest. Any questions about protein?
Yeah, not too much about protein. Mostly just thinking it's more anabolic as opposed to a primary energy source. Yeah, it's all from me.
Yeah, so I mean, I think like I said, the calories per gram, like you can for sure get energy from protein. But yeah, like the point or the function of the protein within the body is that anabolic pathway where you're building tissue.
And in terms of utilizing nutrition for sports performance, would it probably fair to say that protein has its place after a practice or after an athletic event? Probably not much before.
Yes and no. So it's actually, I mean, it depends on how deep you want to go into this conversation. Like there's at like the most superficial level, the protein timing doesn't really matter that much. What matters the most, and I think we talked about this last time when we were going through energy balance. The Eric Helms is one of my favorite on this topic because he's written a literal book on like the importance or priority of different nutrient facts. And so with that in this pyramid, the base and the foundation, the most important thing is caloric balance, energy balance. And then the second is macronutrients. Third is micronutrients. Then it gets up into nutrient timing. And then at the very top is supplements. So what you're talking about is nutrient timing, which again, in a 5-tier system, it's second from the top. It matters very little. If you're trying to like nitpick and get your diet to be like perfect, yeah, there's a place to have the conversation about protein pre and post. But what matters much more is the total protein consumption throughout the day.
Gotcha. Cool.
So
That's
if I had to choose, let's say between eating 100 grams of protein for breakfast in the morning and then nothing else, or eat 20 grams of protein after my practice and nothing else throughout the rest of the day, the 100 grams of protein is going to take a bigger effect than the 20 grams immediately after your training. So the I believe what it's called is the anabolic window or the golden window after training is what people commonly refer to. This has been kind of debunked. There is a slight benefit to doing it right after training, especially with resistance training, but again it gets trumped by the effect size of like total protein consumption throughout the day. So it doesn't really matter that much as long as you're getting enough protein throughout the day.
cool. Yeah, that's helpful to know. So the the window of when you're getting your protein in is not as important as just making sure you're getting the right amount.
For sure, for sure. And so the typical, I believe the FDA, the suggested amount is zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight.
Mm-hmm.
And so for 100, let's say 100 kilogram person, that would be like 220. That's a pretty big person, but 100 kilogram person, you need zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram. That would be 80 grams of protein per day, which is a lot for some people, but for somebody of that size, probably not that hard to eat. The recommended amount for athletes is higher than that, and I believe the consensus is somewhere between 1.2 and 2.0 grams per kilogram, depending on the nature of your sport. And the CSCS for sure will quiz on that. So definitely review the different sports and the different protein recommendation for each of the sports. But again, at the end of the day, like the studies have pretty consistently shown. I think Lane Norton's pretty big on this, where he's like, yeah, there's no real downside to eating more protein. Like some people initially thought that your kidneys were going to be overtaxed by eating more and more protein, but that has been kind of again debunked or kind of shown to be not necessarily the case. And so some diets are even going up as high as like 3 grams per kilogram. which again, going back to that 100 kilogram person, which is a big person, 300 grams of protein in a day. Oh my God, that is a lot of protein. That is a lot of protein. That's about 10 protein shakes if you're at a really dense source of protein. So, yeah, to get that amount of protein in throughout the day, that is hard to do. But um, I was just watching a video on it this morning, actually. They were talking about, it was on RP hypertrophy. I don't know if you've ever followed any of their stuff. They were talking about strongman diet, and they were just showing some of these guys that weigh like 500, 600 pounds and showing what they eat in a day. And it was literally like he woke up and had like 1,800 calories for breakfast. And it was like, I can't remember how many grams of protein it was, 100 grams of protein or something like that in one sitting. It's just like, oh my God, these guys have to be like force feeding themselves. And they're just like miserable immediately after they eat, because they're no longer trying to eat what's like healthy for longevity. They're trying to maximize strength, hypertrophy, and just total mass maintenance. Because like when you weigh 500 pounds, your body's trying to lean out. Your body is trying to become more efficient, and it's trying to get rid of mass in any way, shape, and form. And so that's going to include fat and muscle. Your body doesn't want to be that big. When I was in undergrad, I also talked to our team nutritionist for the football team. And one of the things that I was kind of curious about was like, I saw how much wide receivers and like running backs were eating. And I was like, man, this is just like so much food. It's crazy that they don't get fat. And what they were saying was like, yeah, but like if you look at the linemen, they're actually eating more. It's just that because they're bigger, it seems like less. But long after their football career ends, what's interesting is because the linemen are force feeding themselves to maintain 300 plus body weight, they are effectively, all they have to do is stop force feeding themselves, and then they come back down to a normal weight. So they live a pretty healthy life once they're done playing their competitive sport. Whereas some of these skill positions, wide receivers, running backs, safeties, those guys tend to overeat, and they get away with it because they have such high metabolism and such high exercise burning. And so they get a lot of, basically they can maintain their body weight despite how much they eat because they're exercising so much. But once they stop exercising so much, now they start to pack on the pounds. And so those guys really struggle with their diet after their career. Whereas the linemen who look like they're the more overweight and at risk, they actually come down and normalize pretty easily.
That's pretty interesting. I think I saw a documentary once on Ronnie Coleman, the bodybuilder, and I think he did something very similar. I remember hearing that he used to wake up in the middle of the night just to eat a meal. Like would his sleep short just to get some calories in.
Right.
Yeah, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, physiologically, your body must realize that keeping on all this extra weight isn't beneficial. So it makes sense that the second you start eating normally, you kind of just shed all that extra weight off.
Yeah, that's really interesting that it would be. I mean, I think it was probably Ronnie Coleman was at a time where there wasn't so much like sports science or like weightlifting science, bodybuilding science. And so he was probably just doing like what was like bro science, where it's like, yeah, if you're not eating every 4 hours, then you become in a state of catabolism and you're no longer building muscle. So you have to wake up every 4 hours to make sure you eat, which is probably like, I would guess that the cons of being like sleep deprived is probably harsher on the body for trying to build muscle than the importance of getting that meal in. Like especially with things like supplements. Like now we know that casein is a really slow digesting and slow releasing protein source. Like you could probably just take a double dose of casein before you go to sleep, have a really full stomach, and it's going to be processing basically until you wake up.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty wild. I'm sure they were relying on a lot of bro science back then.
I mean, it worked for him. Kudos, because he's definitely bigger than me. So
Yeah,
he had something, right?
yeah, that's for sure.
And probably a lot of steroids as well. But that's beside the point. Okay, so for the literature review, so there's a ton here, and I'm actually a bit of a nerd or a geek here. I actually really like reading nutrition content. So I have a million more if you're interested, and I can send them your way. But these were just kind of some that I picked that were relevant to this topic. So MyFitnessPal has a blog on their website. And so this one was specifically how much protein is in different types of foods. Specifically, they chose 98 popular food items. And so they went through things like French fries and potato chips and chicken and steak, who knows what else, but they had 98 different food items, which is pretty encompassing. And they just revealed how much protein is in these different food sources so that you can see, okay, well, in this carbohydrate rich food, this is how much protein is typically carried in it. And in this much more lean meat, this is how much protein is in it. So it's a really easy chart if you're curious to just kind of get a general reference and say, make general suggestions like, okay, well, a serving of chicken is probably 20 grams of protein, something like that. Lane Norton, who is one of my favorite on the nutrition topic, he loves to call out nonsense and basically use anything that is backed by good scientific evidence to promote his suggestions. And he's pretty scientifically vigorous, I would say. He's definitely one of the more I guess I would say valid when it comes to like influencers. He takes the time to review not only just the one or two research papers, but he's reviewing a whole body of information and publications before he's putting out his kind of consensus. And in this one, he's talking about the differences between low carb and low fat diets. So obviously there's different conceptualizations or misnomers with these, but most people would think, oh, a low carb diet is really good because you're not going to gain weight. Well, actually, you can gain weight with any macronutrient diet if your caloric balance is out of whack. And so he basically points out some of the health concerns where people think, oh, low fat must be healthy. But actually, in reality, you can have a lot of like vitamin deficiencies, or you can have high carb, which makes up for the extra calories that are cut out by low fat diets. So he does a really good job of giving the bigger picture of everything in that article. Eric Helms is actually probably my favorite above Lane Norton because he talks entirely factually. And he is not only like really smart when it comes to the scientific evidence on this, but also he lives it. So he is a competitive powerlifter. Actually, Lane Norton's a powerlifter as well, and he's won multiple competitions. But Eric Helms is a competitive powerlifter and bodybuilder, which is really impressive because those two are different in nature. One is how lean can you get and how shredded can you get versus the other one, which is like pack on as much mass as you can in order to be really strong for your weight. So Eric Helms is really good. He speaks more positively, more scientific, whereas Lane is like, I'm an influencer. I call out nonsense. So depending on your preference, pick your cup of tea, and you can't go wrong with either of those. But this paper specifically is on NIH's website, and it's nutritional recommendations for physique athletes. So they go in through things like macronutrient profile, your carbs, your fats, your protein suggestions, as well as what you were referring to earlier with the nutrient timing. So how soon after your lift do you want to eat these different macronutrients? So it's a really in-depth breakdown. I think he's not even the lead author on this paper. I think he's the second leading author, but he's still contributed obviously a decent amount to it. They refer to several of his other papers. He's got a website, he's got a book, he's got a ton out there on nutrition content. So if you're interested in learning more, I highly suggest checking out Eric's publications. For the media side of things, Andrew Huberman featured Lane Norton on his YouTube channel or podcast. So if you prefer Spotify, you can throw this one on while you're in the car. Tools for nutrition and fitness. And again, Lane does a really good job of giving like big picture, no nonsense, call out the misconceptions, and really help people have like practical tools for, okay, you're right, this doesn't make any sense to be paranoid about this or preoccupied about this. I should just focus on this instead, which makes my life a lot easier. So he does a really good job of giving practical advice. Second one is Eric Helms on a podcast. He was featured on, I believe it was a bodybuilding podcast, and they were talking about calories and macros for fat loss. So again, if you're trying to lean out, depending on the sport, that may or may not be relevant to the athletes. But it's still good to have an understanding of how caloric balance works and how macronutrient profiles weigh into these different caloric kind of environments, if you will. Lastly is the RP hypertrophy. This is Dr. Mike. I can't remember his last name off the top of my head, but big bald guy, and he is massive. So he definitely knows a thing or two about building muscle. Again, probably a lot of steroids, but nonetheless very muscular. So hitting the right macros, and specifically he has like a lecture where he goes through the different macro profiles, makes suggestions for how much carbs, how much protein, how much fat you should be including in a well-balanced diet, and kind of gives ranges depending on your individual needs. The publication review for this week. This was a meta-analysis looking at soccer players' nutrition. And so they were comparing junior and senior soccer players. And so there were 21 different publications that were reviewed along the way. And so they were looking at the self-reported macronutrient distribution. So we'll get into the specifics, but effectively what they were looking at was for carbs and protein, it was measured by grams per kilogram of body weight, and fat, for whatever reason in the research, tends to be measured as percentage of total energy intake. So if you're eating 1,000 calories, and 300 of them are coming from fat, then that's 30% of your total energy intake. And so that was the way that this fat was measured within the publications that they reviewed. So again, I don't know why they did it that way, as opposed to just normalizing and just getting grams per kilogram. But for whatever reason, that's what the modern research has. So in this paper, they found a few trends. The first and most, I think, concerning or important, again, the lay of the land, as Eric Helms mentions it, is the first and most important piece is the caloric balance, the energy balance. And so we see this trend of decreased caloric consumption across age groups. So this is both in junior and in senior. And so we know that the demands of soccer are going up. The physical nature of the game is increasing. It's becoming more demanding physically. And yet we see a decrease in caloric consumption. So kind of an interesting consideration when you look at things like, okay, well, if your intensity is going up, then surely your caloric content should be going up to match, because you have to refuel, one, your glycogen stores, but also your free glucose. You have to increase your protein content to then rebuild for the next match or training session. So it's really interesting that we see this trend, and this was like a 20-year review. So over multiple decades, they saw a trend of decreased caloric consumption. Similarly, they found a decreased carbohydrate consumption, which was actually lower than the suggested recommendations. They saw a decreased fat consumption, but this was still at the recommended amount per day. And then they saw an increase in protein consumption, which was actually over what the daily recommended amount was. So kind of interesting there, where we see this trend of not only youth and but also senior soccer players that are kind of prioritizing protein. And this, I've talked to a few of our team nutritionists, as well as I went to a sports nutrition conference last summer. And a common finding that they all seem to see in practice is athletes don't eat enough carbs. Specifically, soccer players don't eat anywhere near enough carbs. And so when it comes to performance, they have this misconception where it's like, I need to eat all this protein. In reality, you need like a decent amount of protein, but then you really need to fuel up on carbs. You need to keep your glycogen stores topped off, because you see this kind of gradual effect where your glycogen stores are maybe at 100%, then 90, then 80, then 70. And throughout the course of a training week, you're depleted. And so then when you get to match day, you've got 30 minutes of like good intensity, but then you drop off in intensity as the match goes on. So interesting consideration as we see these kind of trends just over the decades, the last probably 20, 30 years. Specifically with the juniors. So again, this is how they were measuring the averages. So the juniors ranged somewhere between 5.5 to 5.9 grams per kilogram of body weight. This is slightly below what they suggested for soccer athletes. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, if it was 6 or 7-ish. I don't remember, because a high protein or a high carbohydrate diet was 8.5. They identified that in the paper, but I don't remember what the standard amount is. But even lower than the juniors, the seniors were eating 4.3 to 5.0 grams per kilogram of body weight. And so they considered a low carb diet to be anything less than 3.0 grams per kilogram. So if you look at the seniors, especially, this starts to kind of near that lower end as opposed to the higher end where it's 8. So interesting consideration to if you're discussing nutrition with athletes, like especially soccer athletes. Carbs are your cheat code. Carbs are your superfood. So focus. Yes, protein is important, but carbs are more important. Carbs are definitely going to be a better performance enhancement macro than protein. The fat, again, the total energy intake is the percentage of their total caloric intake. And so fat tended to be for junior 31%. The FDA's suggestion here is anything more than 20%. So they're still above that amount. But what we saw was this trend in kind of generation or decades where we've dropped maybe 2%. So the seniors were eating 33%. And over the years, this was decreasing for both juniors and seniors. So still in the healthy amount or the healthy range, but getting lower and lower throughout the years. And then we look at the protein. So again, like the soccer athletes are probably going to be okay with anything between 1.4 and 1.8 grams per kilogram body weight. But we see the juniors that are eating 1.0 to 2.0, and we see the seniors who probably need slightly less are 1.6 to 2.0 grams per kilogram. So they're getting plenty of protein. That's not necessarily a concern. They did talk about the consideration of increasing to a high protein for things like soft tissue injuries, but there's not great evidence on it yet. So they didn't make that recommendation. They said stick with the typical athletic suggestion of somewhere between 1.2 and 2.0 grams per kilogram. So the implications and the suggestions based on the evidence here: avoid a low carb diet for soccer players. This has been correlated with soft tissue injury. So if you get into that below 3.0 grams per kilogram per day range, then you're going to have an increased injury risk, which is obviously a net negative. Nobody wants to have injuries. Consider increasing to a high carb diet. There's benefit to keeping your glycogen stores topped off. And so really the only downside of eating a ton of carbs is that you have to run a lot in order to not gain weight. But soccer players, as we know, run a ton and specifically on game days, like they're depleting their glycogen stores. I don't remember the percentage that they said that they depleted their glycogen stores within their musculature, but it was definitely over 50%. So they're going all out on game day, and they're getting rid of any glycogen stores that are left. So keeping that glycogen stores topped off, specifically match day -1, the day before the game, definitely good to replenish any kind of carbohydrate. Protein is adequate, but it's worth considering moving to a high protein diet, anything even up and over 3.0 grams per kilogram. I think the hardest thing for this population is going to be actually consuming that much protein. It's really hard. As we said, with a 100 kilogram person, that's 300 grams of protein. So even if you look at a really small person, 50 kilograms, they still have to eat, what would that be? 150 grams of protein. Like that's still a lot of protein. So I think it's tough to do practically, but there's no real downside to. So the more protein that you can consume, Jeff Nippard talks about this quite a bit on his channel as well. He's a big bodybuilding guy, but there doesn't seem to be, with modern research, and they equate calorie for calorie, there doesn't really seem to be a limit to how much muscle you can synthesize with more and more protein. It's an asymptotic relationship. So you start to get less and less and less gains from the increased protein content, but it doesn't ever really reach a halt. You never plateau and say anything beyond this amount of protein, you're building less muscle. So there's no real harm in eating more protein other than the fact that it's hard to do. And then lastly is maintain the fat consumption. And again, so they're still well within the safe range for the total energy intake, being above 20% at currently 31 or 33%. But as we see this trending downward, who knows, in 10, 20 years, maybe we get down to that 20% range, or even maybe they're trying to maximize carbohydrate and protein intake, and so then they drop off on their fat consumption. So that can have some interesting implications, especially with those fat soluble vitamins. Any comments, questions about the publication?
Did the paper mention if the athletes were in a caloric deficit purposely? Were they trying to get underneath their adequate caloric intake, or was it accidental and I didn't really realize that they were underfed?
This paper specifically did not investigate that. They weren't asking these athletes why they were doing it. They just asked them to report what they ate. They did talk about it within the paper, within the discussion chapter. They talked about how the modern culture of aesthetics and body image influences things like that, and especially with low carb and not wanting to eat more carbs. And they suggested that anybody that works with athletes should definitely not discourage them from eating more carbs. But they didn't, like I said, this paper specifically didn't dive into the rationale for why they did or did not eat more calories. They just noted that, as reported throughout the years, they saw this trend of decreased caloric consumption. But
Got
again, this was looking at 21 different papers across 30 different years. So it's not necessarily to say this individual is strategically eating less and less calories throughout the years. It's 100 different people from 100 different countries that are looking, okay, this group in this year ate, let's say, 3,000 calories. And then this group in 20 years, they ate 2,000 calories. So they just saw this trend in the data that at year per year, it was getting less and less.
Got it. Yeah, it's really interesting. I wonder if, the popularization of, body image and carbs being looked at as a negative thing and protein being the answer to everybody's problems kind of influenced that.
100%, it did. It's just a matter of what's the effect size. How much did it influence those things, as opposed to, is it just kind of a coincidence where we saw just maybe this group of athletes weren't hungry and they just didn't like to eat as much. They felt really full, or maybe they were really tired, so they just went to sleep. They forgot to eat a post-training meal, something like that. Like there's some one-offs that could happen, but I think some more qualitative research would help to kind of tease that out. I don't know if I didn't read through the references in this paper, but I'm sure there are qualitative studies that talk about that very topic within athletes.
Very cool.
Cool. So that wraps up for tonight. Again, the summary of the different macronutrients, there's only 3. There's no real way of getting around it: carbs, fat, and protein. And they all have very specific roles. Carbs are the primary energy source and should be encouraged. They give you superpowers. If you want to be Superman, then you can fly because you ate carbohydrates. If you eat fat, then you can absorb all your fat soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. So don't skimp out on your fat sources either. Anything above 20% is still considered to be acceptable. And then protein will help you to rebuild all of your different muscle, bone, anything that's going to be damaged or strained during athletic exercise. So protein consumption also is important, but carbohydrate is definitely the most important and most underconsumed of the 3 macros. That should do it for tonight. And then next meeting, we'll talk about micronutrients. So looking at things like vitamins and minerals.